Right back to the beginning of the presidential campaign, though, and try to get you to describe how you decided to run for president. Was there a moment that you were like, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this? Did you talk to Judy about it? How did that happen?
Well, first of all, you know, I didn't win, so I've had 10 years to think about the campaign. And what I realized was that actually probably Joe gets more credit than I do for the campaign. The great genius of our campaign was not that I was, was against the war and all that stuff when nobody else was. The great genius of the campaign was that we had tons and tons of 23-year-olds like Joe came to work for us, and we actually listened to them and let them pretty much decide what to do. And that is how this all got built. So I actually see our campaign as, for those who are a little grayer, even though I bear no resemblance whatsoever to Gene McCarthy in many ways, our campaign was in some ways the Gene McCarthy campaign of the 60s, where it was the first expression of a whole new generation, which I call first globals, not millennials. And that's what really the campaign was all about. It wasn't as well organized as it might have been, but we sure had a hell of a lot of fun. And I do think that we revolutionized politics, but not because I was revolutionizing politics, because what I did was give the freedom of young people to come to the campaign and revolutionize politics, and that's really what happened. For those of you who don't know me very well, Joe's question was somewhat of a loaded question. I didn't ask anybody, including my wife, about whether it was a good idea to run for president. So I'll tell you the story about how I got to run for lieutenant governor. I was in the legislature for 2 terms, and everything in Vermont, until you get to the top 5 offices, is part-time, including lieutenant governor. So during my second term, Judy and I were about to have our second child, and that was clearly much too much for our small loft apartment in downtown Burlington, for which we were paying a huge amount of $125 a month for. And so we had to move, and we had to move out of my district. And in the district I moved to, there were 2 state reps, both of whom were Democrats, incumbents, so I wasn't going to run against them. I could have run for the Senate in Chittenden County, but Chittenden County, by Vermont standards, is a big, very expensive county, and I could have run against Jim Jeffords, which would have been a losing proposition, but I figured, you get your name out, or I could have run for lieutenant governor, and I figured, Chittenden County race is just as hard as a lieutenant governor, so you might as well run for lieutenant governor. So then I thought I was being so smart and clever, and I was about 35 or something, and I sit down with this rookie reporter from the Rutland Herald, which at the time was the most respected paper in the state in terms of politics, people who knew politics and so forth. And I'm trying to do what I think is so clever. The southern part of the state has no idea who I am whatsoever, because the Burlington Free Press is the big paper in my area. And so I'm trying to hint and float a trial balloon. And I think I'm so smart and so sophisticated. And the next day, in the front page of the Herald, because it's a Saturday and not much is going on, deemed to run for number 2 spot. So I'm working a Saturday morning, and my wife gets a call. What do you think about your husband running for lieutenant governor? She goes, what? So the presidential decision was pretty much made the same way.
And so you talked about the grassroots movement that came up around the campaign. I guess the question is, was that on purpose?
No. Actually, opposing the war wasn't on purpose either. I think one of the charms that the campaign had was that I pretty much said what I thought, which of course got me into trouble on numerous occasions. But it was kind of refreshing to have somebody who actually said what they thought and didn't consult 19 polls to see what they should think. So what happened was, first of all, I realized over the last 10 years that the people I was really running against were the Democratic Party. Because the Democratic Party had completely lost its way. It had deregulated Wall Street, which was a disaster. We're still paying the price for that. They had voted for Bush's tax cuts, which really led to this enormous deficits that Obama keeps getting blamed for. The truth is those deficits are mostly, A, the recession was caused by Bush, B, the tax cuts which were caused by Bush, and C, the Iraq War. That's where the deficits come from. So Obama gets virtually no blame for the deficits whatsoever. And you can't say that when you've been president for 6 years, but that in fact is the truth. So the Democratic Party was becoming increasingly what now we would call corporatist. And they'd given up. They just weren't fighting for a better country. And so what happened, so I actually intended to run on balancing the budget, which I thought was important, and on universal health care, which hadn't been looked at for a long time. And then the Iraq War came along, and I'm not that much of a dove. I mean, I supported the first Iraq War because I thought we had a treaty obligation to Kuwait. I thought I supported Afghanistan because they harbored people who killed 3,000 Americans. But I'd also lived through Vietnam, and I read the British press online, and I was even then, and mostly the Guardian and the Independent. And in Britain, they publish defense stuff that you couldn't get published here. And the two intelligence agencies in the world that are closest are actually not the Israeli and American intelligence agency, they're British and the American intelligence agency. So I was pretty sure whatever the British knew, the Americans knew. And the British were saying, the British intelligence was saying that there, in fact, was absolutely no weapons of mass destruction program in Iraq. And they were also saying, that, because Cheney was trying to make out that they had an atomic weapons program, which turned out to be complete horseshit. And they were, well, I said what I think, right? That word I actually did not use that word during the campaign, but that's about the only one I didn't. So it turned out that what the Brits were telling their people, which was getting in the paper, was that there was probably not an atomic program, but even if there was 5 years from any progress. So I've been in this movie before, when the President of the United States was lying to our faces and sending 55,000 kids to die in Vietnam. And I didn't want to see that movie again. And that's how I got to be against the Iraq War. I was an agnostic. I mean, I'm not a foreign, or at the time I didn't know that much about foreign policy. And I'm thinking to myself, these guys are lying to our face, and if they're lying to our face, I don't know what the facts are, but I do know they're lying, and we shouldn't be going to war if we're being lied to. If the president and the vice president think it's okay to lie to us, those people, A, shouldn't be in office, and B, we shouldn't be going to war over it. So that very bluntness also unearthed, actually the support of the campaign was actually a bimodal distribution. The young people were drawn to the campaign because somebody was willing to stand up and say what was what. And young people have always been drawn to frankness. As you grow older, you realize that's not the best political tactic. But that's the way I am, and I wasn't going to change. And there was also a ton of people my age who had given up on politics. They came out in droves. I mean, a 10,000 person rally, which is what we had in Seattle, just blew me away. Now, by Obama standards, that's not all that big. But it was an incredible thing. And what was happening was people who didn't believe in politics because of all the shenanigans that had gone on suddenly began to think that there was hope again. And the 23-year-olds came in, and we didn't know how to do any of this stuff. Joe and his huge team, all of whom were being paid about $200 a week when they got paid at all in the beginning, were basically, we had these old clunky sites. First of all, remember, there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no YouTube, there was email. We had this company called Convio, which somehow has still survived. And Lieberman and Gephardt were using Convio at the same time. So every time we sent out an email and all these gazillion dollars of contribution, their sites would crash, giving us a double benefit. So these guys were inventing this stuff on the fly. They were inventing all the tools on the fly. We had a lot of interesting stuff, but nobody had figured out how to put together. Of course, in those days, everybody over 30 was completely incompetent when it had to do anything to do with the internet, except for a tiny handful of geniuses. But the people who were 23 knew everything. So we just said, this is great, you take over the campaign, I'll just go out and talk for a while.
Well, so, I wouldn't know about either myself, but I imagine that going out and talking and being a full-time presidential candidate is different than being a governor. You're the candidate, you're the talent. Being a governor, you're in charge of the thing. And so can you talk a little bit about the difference of running a state versus running a campaign in that way?
Yeah, I didn't run the campaign, and that was a mistake. No, you should never, the candidate should never actually run the campaign, but we were in a lot of disarray back in Burlington, and that was one of the biggest problem was me, of course, because I would say what I thought, and I was impulsive, and what I said was true, but you do get penalized for telling the truth. I remember when Saddam Hussein was captured, it was the day I gave my first major foreign policy address, and it was to a group of the foreign affairs people in LA. And so we worked out this speech, and it was about 5 or 6 pages of single-spaced stuff I was supposed to read, which I absolutely hated reading speeches. I hated it with a passion. But I agreed to do it because every I had to be dotted and T had to be crossed, and it was all very diplomatic language. And when Saddam was captured, I didn't call the office. I didn't talk to any of the foreign policy people, and we had some very good people who were working with us, including actually Susan Rice and Sandy Berger. And I didn't call any of them. I just crossed out a few lines and put, "And we are not safer now that Saddam Hussein has been captured." Now that was true. And, you know, this was irrelevant that but it was a really stupid thing to do on a triumphal day where everybody could feel proud of the American Armed Forces for having captured this terrible person who was hiding out in a cellar somewhere. And so that's the kind of stuff that just didn't help, you know. I mean, when you have a candidate that basically does what they damn well please after you've agreed to do something else, probably that was a problem. The other problem is we had a lot of management of the top problems, which I'm not going to go into. And the third problem, our operation in Iowa was the problem, and we didn't have the means to fix it, and that was the only state I didn't understand. We were way ahead of everybody else. Kerry actually had to borrow our electors in New York State. New York State's the most complicated state to get in the ballot of any state in the country by far, because you have to have a certain amount of signatures in each one of the 45 counties or whatever it is, and then you have to have 3 electors from each one of the counties, and we had a full slate, nobody else did. And so our on-the-ground people were unbelievable, but there were lots of problems in the campaign, and that's I think is the real reason that we didn't do it. And you can't really run your campaign if you're running for president, and you shouldn't, but you do have to have a very disciplined, experienced organization.
Right. Well, it wasn't just us. It was there were a bunch of guys out there trying to stop us.
Well, there was that too.
So actually, I wonder if you remember this episode from the campaign. It was right when SEIU was about to endorse, and the AP reported that the other campaigns, Kerry and Gephardt and Edwards, were actually having conference calls regularly to coordinate their attacks and to try to make sure that they could block the SEIU endorsement.
It was actually, as I remember, it was Edwards actually stayed out of it, to his credit. It was Lieberman, Kerry, Gephardt, and Wes Clark, who was in fact put in by these are stories you've never heard before. I probably never told this one in public before, but I'm going to tell it. So the day that Gore endorsed us, which is the 9th of December, this is a big surprise in all this. So after he endorses us in New York, we fly to Iowa and do an endorsement there, and then he has to fly to Sweden or someplace, and I'm flying back because, of course, I had disrupted my schedule. And I get a call on the phone as we're taking off, and it's with President Clinton. And he said, "Hey, Howard, how are you?" I said, "Oh, Mr. President, I'm just great." He said, I learned 2 things from this call. He said, I know there's a lot of rumors around that the Clintons have been supporting Wes Clark. That is just not so. It is not true. And I said, And I knew exactly how long he was going to talk. He was going to talk for 37 minutes, because that's how long every phone call. He once called me in a candy store in New York. I was buying, in Vermont, I was buying presents. Phone rings, I'm at the cashier's desk, and it's Bill Clinton at the other end of the line. Right? It's Christmas time. So he says, that is not so. And so we talked for a while, but then the plane is taking off. So cell phones do not disrupt plane takeoffs, I don't think. So the plane is taking off, and we're getting higher and higher. And finally, of course, the cell drops off, and that's the end of the call with the president. So I learned 2 things. One, I learned he thought I was going to win, although he never said that because he wouldn't have called me. And 2, I knew that they indeed had gotten Wes Clark to get into the race and try to get me out of it, which is why he called me to insist that he hadn't.